Okay, so what if one of the greatest novels ever written, we're talking Tolstoy's War and Peace, wasn't just a story? What if it was actually an accidental blueprint for a scientific theory of history? Yeah, you heard that right. And that's exactly the wild idea we're going to unpack today. I mean, think about it. All the biggest turning points in history, wars, revolutions, the total collapse of entire civilizations, we usually think of them in terms of politics or economics, right? But what if? What if they're not that different from an earthquake or a storm? What if they follow predictable physical laws? That's the mind-bending question we're diving into. So, here's the core theory we're looking at. It argues that whole societies behave like a giant complex brain. Seriously, they can accumulate stress, they can absorb shocks, but sometimes they just fracture under the pressure. It's a pretty wild and maybe even a little unsettling way to look at our world. All right, so where do we even begin with an idea this big? Well, our first step is to go looking for this hidden engine. We're going to go way past the headlines and the famous names to try and uncover the deeper mechanics that are really shaping our world. And here's the kicker. Our guide on the scientific journey is Leo Tolstoy. Yeah, the novelist. Believe it or not, it turns out his deep, deep observations about the Napoleonic Wars were way more than just great literature. They were basically an intuitive description of a universal law, something he figured out decades before modern science even had the words for it. Okay, so let's get into Tolstoy's radical idea. Because before we can even touch the science, you have to understand his view of history. And let me tell you, he thought the way most of us learn about the past is completely, 100% backward. So on one hand, you've got the classic great man theory of history, right? The idea that these larger-than-life figures, a Napoleon, a Caesar, they shape events with their genius and their will. But Tolstoy, he argued the exact opposite. He saw Napoleon not as the cause of the war, but more like a label, just a name we stick on this massive, unstoppable wave of collective human action. Tolstoy put it so bluntly, a king is history's slave. For him, that was the simple truth. Leaders don't actually direct events. They are dragged along by them. History isn't made by a few brilliant commands from the top. Nope. It's the sum of countless, tiny, individual choices, a force that no single person could ever hope to control. Okay, and this is where things get really, really cool. We're now going to translate Tolstoy's literary intuition into a proper scientific framework. We're taking his big ideas about historical forces and giving them the concrete language of physics and, well, stress mechanics. So the first key concept we need to get our heads around is something called viscoelasticity. Sounds complicated, but just think of it as a society's flexibility. A healthy, adaptive system, it's like silly putty. You can stretch it, you can pull it, you can put it under all sorts of pressure, but it doesn't break. On the other hand, a rigid, brittle system is more like a dry twig. It holds its shape perfectly right up until you put just a little too much pressure on it and then snap. And when that twig snaps, you get what the theory calls a strain discharge. This is what war and revolution really are. They're not just planned political moves. They're chaotic, physical releases of all that pent-up societal pressure. It's that moment when a system can't bend anymore, so it has no choice but to break. So this dynamic creates this universal cycle. Being versus becoming. Being is that state of peace, of stability. Everything seems calm. But even in that calm, invisible stresses can be building up under the surface. Becoming, then, is that turbulent phase of war and change. It's how the system violently reorganizes itself to release all that stress, so it can find a new, stable state of being. And here, look at this. This is where it all just clicks into place. It's like a Rosetta Stone for history. Suddenly, Tolstoy's literary themes map perfectly onto the scientific model. War becomes a chaotic strain discharge. Peace is a period of structural stability. Those powerful leaders, they're just temporary nodes in a giant stress field. And history itself, it's the movement of this global viscoelastic thing. It's incredible. Okay, so let's move away from the abstract theory for a bit and get into some concrete examples. We're going to apply this lens to some real-world events from recent history and see how well it actually holds up.
The collapse of the Soviet Union is just a textbook case study for this. First, you've got decades of built-up internal strain, economic failure, ideological fatigue, ethnic tensions. Second, the system itself was incredibly rigid. It had very low viscoelasticity. So when Gorbachev's reforms tried to let off a little steam, the system was just too brittle to handle it. The strain completely exceeded its capacity, and the result wasn't a gradual change, it was a catastrophic, rapid failure. It couldn't bend, so it just shattered.
Now let's contrast that with a system that could bend, even when it was under enormous pressure. Take the whole Brexit process in the UK. I mean, regardless of what you think about it politically, it was an incredibly high-strain event. But the system had these institutional valves, things like referendums, parliamentary debates, elections, to release that pressure over time. The result was messy, sure, and it was long, but it was an adaptive reconfiguration. It wasn't a sudden, catastrophic break like we saw with the Soviet Union. And, this isn't just about superpowers. You can see these same patterns of strain and release playing out everywhere. Think of the Arab Spring, where you had these synchronized waves of pressure that quickly toppled rigid regimes that just had no flexibility. Or look at the disintegration of Yugoslavia, where removing that central unifying force allowed old, deep fault lines to just rupture violently. So after all that, what's the big takeaway here? Why does this lens even matter? Well, this isn't just some interesting academic exercise. It actually gives us a really powerful new mental model for making sense of the world around us. When you boil it all down, the theory suggests that there are these universal rules of strain. Systems collapse when the pressure exceeds their ability to adapt. Simple as that. They stay stable when they have lots of valves to release that pressure. And those calm periods, that being phase, they're often when invisible stress is quietly building up. The chaotic becoming phase is just how systems get rid of that stress. And the main point is, no civilization is exempt from these cycles. Now, it's really important to be clear about something. This model is not a crystal ball, okay? It doesn't tell us exactly what's going to happen next. What it does is help us understand the structural physics at play, the deep underlying forces that make certain futures more or less likely. And that really leaves us with a final, powerful question to chew on. If our world truly is this giant web of stress and strain, if you look at everything through this lens, where are the fault lines today? Where do you see the pressure building? That's definitely something to think about.